Okay, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Julie Hatcher, who many of Coastwise will know, good friend to Coastwise. Julie is a marine biologist working in marine conservation in Dorset, passionate about the marine environment, never happier than when pottering around in rock pools, strandline surveys or diving, along with her husband and co-author Steve Truella, who a lot of us know as well. Julie's work involves raising awareness of the marine environment and marine and coastal wildlife in the UK. She writes articles for newspapers and magazines, designs leaflets and interpretation boards. She also leads guided rock pool rambles, seashore identification training courses, and has been a scuba diver for many years, particularly in the UK. Julie's been the head warden at the Dorset Wildlife Trust Marine Centre in Kimmeridge since 2004. Julie loves surprising and enthusing people about marine life and is very good at it. Julie and Steve have written 2 books together, which I definitely recommend. The Essential Guide to Beachcombing and Strandline, and The Essential Guide to Rock Pooling, which I know a lot of us have got. Well, I think several of us got both of them. And Julie and Steve did come to talk to us as well about those. Julie's also very active on Twitter at JZ Fantasy, lots of lovely pictures and little anecdotes, and writes the occasional blog on Essential Guide to Rock Pooling. Together with Steve, Julie's organised projects to record strandline invertebrates, as well as carrying out dive surveys for things like seahorses and stalk jellyfish. And Julie's now going to talk to us about why, when most of us in the cold, dark winter evenings are hunkering down indoors, Julie and Steve are out there getting ready and going for dives. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you. Thanks, Leisha. That was very comprehensive. Right, well, thanks very much for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm at home at the moment. I'm off work. I've had an operation on my hand, so it's nice to have something to keep me occupied while I'm kind of stuck indoors. I can't drive or anything, so I'm a bit marooned at home at the moment, and not able to dive either. So it's been nice looking through old photographs and getting this talk together. So I'm going to talk to you about what it's like and why we dive in the winter when the water's actually at its coldest. So most UK divers, they either go diving in warm tropical waters, or else they are concentrating on historic shipwrecks on the UK seabed. But I belong to a small number of divers who take pleasure from seeing and photographing colourful and fascinating wildlife living in our shallow coastal waters, and to an even smaller number who do this year round. And when I say shallow coastal waters, I'm talking about sort of the intertidal at high tide down to a maximum of about 5 metres. That's where we're normally diving. So it really is shallow. And as I say, sometimes it's intertidal at high tide. So the sea temperature in the UK, the sea temperature in the south and southwest of England varies between around 20 degrees in the summer down to around 6 degrees Celsius in the winter. Although here in Dorset, it rarely drops below about 8 degrees. And that's the temperature we're seeing at the moment. Obviously, you know, if you're going to go diving in 8-degree temperature water, you really need a dry suit. So if you were in a wetsuit, and I do know people that go certainly snorkeling in wetsuits, but they don't manage to stay in for very long, not more than about 20 minutes. And I have to say they're tougher than me, because I don't think I'd be in for that long. So if you want to stay in for longer than that, you really need a dry suit. And for me, in addition to a dry suit, I also have a battery operated heated undervest that I wear underneath my dry suit, super thick mitts and hood. And with these, I'm able to dive for just over an hour. Although my husband Steve can stay in, if he goes on his own or without me, he can stay in for a couple of hours or more. But I get very cold after an hour, I have to say. But it's only in around the last 5 years or so that I've dived all year round. I used to be a sort of spring, summer diver. And it does seem a bit contrary when you're heading out at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just as everyone else is retreating to the warmth and comfort of their homes. And especially as the temperature tends to plummet at that time of day anyway. So why on earth do we dive in the winter? What makes it worth getting cold and wet outdoors when everyone else is indoors? Well, of course, it's the wildlife. And the attraction of winter UK diving is the very different and often abundant wildlife that you see. In winter, because the days are so short, and the angle of the sun is very low, it means it can be dark underwater from late afternoon. And that means that nocturnal animals are active for longer. And there's less cover from seaweed as well, because of course in the winter with reduced sunlight, the seaweed tends to die back. And so you see the sort of the understory of sessile animals revealed more than in the summer when they tend to be covered up. So I thought I'd show you a few of my favourite animals, and hopefully, although some of them will be familiar with you from rock pools, you might see them from a different angle really, and also hopefully there are some that don't normally feature in marine life talks. So I'm going to start with my very, very favourite animal, the bobtail squid. And I've come to love these little animals because of winter night diving, really, although you do see them occasionally in the summer and in the daytime. We see a lot more of them and we get closer encounters in the winter. So bobtail squid are cephalopods, obviously like cuttlefish, squid, octopus, but they are in a group of their own. So this one here is called the little cuttlefish, Sepiola atlantica, although it isn't a cuttlefish and it isn't a squid, it is a bobtail. So as I say, a group of their own. And they are so cute. Yeah, there are 2 UK species and we only see the Sepiola atlantica, the little cuttlefish, but there is also a stout bobtail, Rossia marcosoma, which looks very similar, but maybe a bit more robust looking. And you tend to see that although they are recorded in the south, they seem to be more common the further north you go, and certainly around Scotland, they see a lot of them. But I'm going to talk about the little cuttlefish, this one here. They can grow up to about 6 centimetres long. They have a plump, very rounded body. The ones we see are generally much smaller, and quite often just about the size of your fingernail, so very tiny. And they are attracted, like a lot of these animals that I'm going to show you, they seem to be attracted by the light. So when we go diving, it's often pitch black by the time we get in the water, by the time we've kitted up and walked into the water. And so we are swimming in a little pool of torchlight. So we have torches, we have video lights often, and we have our flashlights for the cameras, our flashes. But we're swimming around in a little pool of light surrounded by pitch black sea. And so animals tend to be attracted to the light, a bit like moths to a flame. And so they come into the torchlight, and bobtails do this. The reason is because they are hunting, they're active predators, and they're searching for food, and often their food is also attracted to the light. And so it's a good place for them to hunt. But of course, this makes them vulnerable. They have many predators of their own. And so if they're lit up in the torchlight, then there are predators that could take them. So we try to be very careful, you know, not to keep them in the torchlight for too long. Quite often in daylight, they bury in the sand. So they are more active nocturnally. So they bury in the sand, just their eyes poking out like this one here. And quite often they'll completely bury themselves in sand, and then they'll use a couple of their 8 tentacles just to wipe away the sand from their eyes, like a little windscreen wiper. Obviously, if they bury, then we leave them alone. We take the torchlight off them so they're back in the dark and they're safe. Another ability they have, like all cephalopods, is that they can instantly and magically change their colour to blend in with the background. And this one here changed from, you know, the browny, reddy browny colour to almost transparent, white against the white sand, as you can see. They have a variety of different cells in their skin. Some of them reflect light, and some of them are filled with pigment that they can expand and contract to either show or hide the colour. And that's how they have this, this amazing ability to alter their colour and make themselves almost invisible. As a last defense, if they feel threatened, what they can do is they can produce a little sac of ink, which acts like a smoke screen, to distract a predator while they make their escape. And they escape backwards by squirting water from their siphon. You can see the little siphon just poking out from under the mantle in this photograph. And they can direct the siphon so they can direct their direction of retreat. But when they do this, it's really a last-ditch attempt. It's very energy expensive and dangerous for them, because they use up a lot of energy to produce that ink and to expel it, and they can squirt out several little blobs of ink to distract a predator, which then goes for the ink rather than going for them while they make their escape. But also, because they're swimming backwards at speed, they could very easily bump into something, a rock or something that could damage them. Now, cephalopods have very soft, sensitive, vulnerable skin. They don't have scales like fish. They don't have a shell to protect them. Their skin is very easily damaged, and if it's damaged, it doesn't repair very well. They don't have that ability, and so it can result in their death. So we are very careful not to harass them, not to stress them. You know, if they come up to us in the light, then we'll, excuse me, we'll take a photo or two, but then we move away, we move the lights away. If they show any signs of burying, if they're changing colour, then we leave them alone, because there'll always be others to come along in the future if we want to get a photo. So another cephalopod that we see more in the winter, in fact, we don't see them in the summer. I don't think I've ever seen one in the summer, but again, they're nocturnal, so that's probably why we see more of them in the winter. And that is the squid. And there are a couple of species that we can come across. One of them, the largest one, is the common squid, Loligo vulgaris, which can measure between 15 and 40 centimetres long, so they can be quite large. But the one we often see is the smaller one, which is this one here, Aloteuthis subulata, which only measures up to about 20 centimetres long. But again, the ones we see are often much smaller. And they have this very long pointed tail that you can see here. And again, they're attracted to the lights, but they rarely linger. So it can be very frustrating actually trying to photograph animals, because they'll come into the light, but they'll keep at the edge of the pool of light. And when you're trying to get a little bit closer just to focus your camera, they're backing away as you're trying to approach them. And then suddenly they'll just shoot off and disappear. So I have never successfully managed to get a photograph of a squid, and that's why I'm using my husband's photographs here, because he's much cleverer than I am with a camera. You can see that they hold their tentacles, their 8 tentacles plus the 2 extendable tentacles that they use to catch their food. They hold them together and form this torpedo shape, which is a very efficient swimming shape for them. And here we have one approaching the camera. So the 2 species breed in this country, and they often breed in shallow water where we can see the eggs. Allotuthis breeds in the summer months and lays smaller, more rounded, balloon-shaped egg masses, little clusters of these balloons, and each one packed with lots and lots of eggs. You can see the eggs inside. But the common squid, loligo, breeds in the colder months, and it lays much longer sausage-shaped eggs in a big cluster. And you've probably seen them washed up after stormy weather. They often wash up on the beach, as this cluster here did. And again, each sausage-shaped egg mass is packed full of tiny eggs. And in the past, we have managed to pick these up, put them in a marine aquarium and hatch out the tiny baby squid. I don't think I've ever seen the smaller Allotuthis eggs washed up on the shore. Maybe that's because it's not so stormy when they're laying their eggs in the summer. Another animal that we see a lot of in the winter but never see in the summer actually is the bubble snail, Hammonia navicula. And bubble snails are a type of epistobranch gastropod mollusk. So they have a tiny shell, a very thin, fragile shell, which is almost covered by their mantle. So it's almost internalized, but they still have a remnant shell, although they can't retreat inside it. And during the spring and summer, in the seagrass meadows where we dive, they're often covered in the egg masses of this animal. And they're kind of yellowy, quaver shaped. When I say quaver, I mean the crunchy snack rather than the musical note. And they are, obviously the little dots inside the jelly are individual eggs. So it's an egg mass. And the seagrass fronds are completely, decorated with these masses and masses of them, but we never see the adults. And it was only when we started diving through the winter that we realized that that's when you see them. I mean, they are nocturnal. So during the day, they are buried beneath the sand, and at night they emerge. And certainly in the winter months, they emerge in abundance, presumably to mate. So they gather in dense aggregations, and they get their name bubble snail because of the appearance of the remnant shell that you can see there, the yellow bit towards the rear end of the animal. Sometimes they're yellow, sometimes they're whitish, and sometimes they're completely covered by the mantle, but this one has its shell partially exposed. You can see the parapodial lobes of the mantle at the sides. They're just creeping up over the sides to partially hide it. Southwest England is their northerly limit, so you don't find them in the north. They can grow up to about 70 70 centimetres. I've just realised 70 centimetres. I don't think that's right. I think it must be 7 centimetres. I've written down 70, but I think they can grow up to about 7 centimetres, but usually they're around half this size when we see them, but certainly large enough to see clearly. They're not tiny. Here we've got a little group. So in the winter, the seagrass and the surrounding sand is absolutely covered in them. Masses and masses, hundreds of them. They really are big aggregations that you never ever see in the summer months. And they are among a small group of animals that have a head, what's called a head shield. And you can see the little kind of, it's almost like an upside down heart, which is their head, and then the mantle behind. They have 2 eye spots, so the little tiny black dots surrounded by paler skin, those are their eye spots, and they can detect light and shade, but really that's their very simple eyes. And if they're threatened, they can release a chemical as a pheromone in the water, which warns others to make their escape. And of course, when they escape, they bury in the sand. You do see them crawling over the sand, and they produce this rather strange, it's very strange to watch them because they produce like a carpet of mucus that they crawl along over the sand. So that's beneath them. But also as they crawl along, the mucus kind of goes over the top of them like a conveyor belt, and it carries sand grains. So as they're crawling along, you can see these tiny sand grains moving up and over their body on this invisible conveyor belt of mucus. And I suppose that's to protect their skin from being damaged by the coarse sand grains. But very interesting to watch. Something I'm sure you're familiar with are sea spiders, pycnogonids, that you can find intertidally. This one here that I'm going to talk about is a species called the gangly lancer, or Nymphon gracile is the scientific name. And pycnogonids are not directly related to land spiders, but they look very similar. They have 8 legs, a tiny body, almost non-existent body actually, and some of them have a proboscis, they have palps, and they have chelophores, which are kind of appendages around the head. They also have a pair of ovigerous, I don't know if I've pronounced that right, but ovigerous legs, which are much shorter. They're not for walking, they're just for carrying the egg masses, and also they're used for grooming. And here we can see a male sea spider with a little bundle of eggs on either of its ovigerous legs. And I have to admit, I am an arachnophobe. I don't like spiders, but sea spiders and spider crabs, I'm fine with. I've never understood why, but it is a bit creepy, I have to say, at night when you're diving in the dark in your little pool of torchlight, and these spiders kind of parachute down from above onto the seabed because they're swimming around in the water. They're not crawling around on the seabed. And you suddenly see them parachute down like this with their legs all splayed out to land on the seabed. And as I say, they swim in the water, and they swim by cycling their legs. It's very sort of elegant looking, but a little bit creepy for someone like me, who I don't mind sea spiders really, but at night in the dark in the winter, it does look a little bit creepy, I feel. They only live for about a year, and they breed subliterally in the winter. So that's why we're seeing them when we're winter night diving out in the open. In the spring, the males carry the eggs back to the intertidal. So that's where they kind of live most of the time. They just come into the shallow sublittoral to breed. And we do see them in numbers. And we use a light trap. It's a bit like an underwater moth trap. So we put it out in the evening with the light in it and then collect it the next morning. And we see what has swum in there and got trapped. Often it's tiny things, little isopods, sometimes prawns. Quite often we get sea spiders in there. And obviously we let them go once we've had a look. But what we found was we were putting these light traps out in the winter and getting masses and masses of sea spiders. So not just one or two, but big balls of them all stuck together in a big kind of tennis ball sized mass, just all legs. And that was a very weird thing that, you know, you wouldn't know about unless you put the light trap out. But we do see a lot of them diving in the winter. Something else that we see more of in the winter than in the summer, although you do find them all year round, are worms. And I don't know why we see more of them in the winter. Is it because they're more abundant, or is it because they are feeding more in the winter, or is it because there's less seaweed cover to hide them? We don't know, but certainly you see masses of them through the winter months in shallow water. And peacock worms are really, when people think of British seas, they often think, oh, they're just cold, grey, boring, nothing but worms, as if worms are boring. And I use peacock worms as an example of how marine worms are not at all what people think of as worms. They're beautiful. So peacock worms grow up to about 30 centimetres long. They're fairly large, but you never see the actual worm because they live inside a tube that they build themselves out of particles of sand and mud and mucus. And the tube can stand up to 10 centimetres above the surface of the seabed. And out of the top of the tube, they extend their feeding tentacles, this beautiful, very delicate, feathery crown. Of course, the crown is very vulnerable because it's sticking out into the water column like a big fishing net. And so they can, the crown has eye spots that it can detect light and shade. And if they detect any threat, I think they can also probably detect water pressure as well. So as you get closer to them, they'll suddenly retreat very rapidly into the tube for protection. But they use their feathery crown of tentacles to catch both food from the water column, but also building materials. So they're always looking for more grains of sand and mud with which to extend their tube. And as the particles, whether it be food or building material, are caught in the tentacles, they're then passed down towards the mouth in the center of the funnel. It's like a funnel. And there they're graded and they're either passed as food into the gut, or they are graded as for size, and the suitable sizes of sand and mud grains are retained, and if anything too large gets in there, then obviously it's ejected. And they can form forests on the seabed, so you can get really dense aggregations of these tubes and peacock worms. And lots of things can live on their tubes, so sea squirts, sponges, you can get sea slugs on there, skeleton shrimps. And in a way, it forms a little ecosystem of its own. And photographing them can be quite frustrating, because if you're just trying to get closer just to get them into focus, you're looking through your viewfinder of your camera and you suddenly realize you're looking at nothing, because the crown has been retracted into the tube and the animal's disappeared. But if you're patient and you wait, they will quite often emerge slowly when they realize that actually the threat is gone, or there is no threat. They will re-emerge, and that's what's happening here in this photograph. But they can be very colourful, so they tend to be reds and pinks, purples, those kind of colours. Sometimes they're very pale and just white, but they're very, very pretty and easy to photograph in some ways because they don't run away. So I've got lots and lots of photographs of peacock worms. Another animal that you're probably familiar with from the seashore is the long-legged spider crab, a Macropodia. There are a couple of species, or a few species, which are hard to tell apart. But they are, like all spider crabs, they're decorator crabs. And so they snip off bits of growth, whether it be seaweed or seagrass or sponge or hydroid. And they plant it onto their shell, onto their legs and their carapace. And they can become completely covered. And it's for camouflage, so that while they're on the seabed, they just look like a piece of seaweed or sponge or whatever, and not like an animal. And their shell is covered in tiny, tiny little hooks that act like Velcro. So when they stick anything on there, it stays attached. And then, of course, if it's well, whatever it is, it can carry on growing. So they don't kill the stuff that they plant on them. It's kind of like a living roof, if you like. So the more it grows, the better the camouflage. And as a crab, of course, they are nocturnal. They're very well camouflaged. You do see them in the daytime, but at night, what we've noticed in winter is that they climb up in the dark to the topmost fronds of algae and seagrass, like into the canopy, and they just hang there. And again, for an arachnophobe like myself, it can look a bit creepy because they're just hanging there in the, above head height as you're diving on the seabed, swimming along the seabed. They're kind of at head height or above, just hanging with their legs splayed out. I don't know why they do this, whether they're going up there to feed or for breeding, to find a mate. We don't know why, but it's something that you don't see in the daytime or in the summer, but certainly in the winter. It's very noticeable, and there are lots and lots of them. Another one. Crabs, of course, mostly are nocturnal, and so if you're diving at night, you're more likely to see them out and about, feeding. In the daytime, they tend to hide away under rocks, or in the case of this masked crab here, they bury in the sand. Masked crabs are so called because of the little face that you see on their carapace. I don't know if you can see there, maybe a bit more clearly here. Looks like a big fat nose with some eyes about halfway down. Anyway, that's why it's called a masked crab. And it buries itself in the sand very efficiently. Its body is shaped to be very rapidly buried in the sand. It just disappears down as if it's disappearing into water. But it keeps the two antennae up above the seabed, so extended into the water column. So that's all you would see if it was buried in the sand, are the two antennae, and they fit together. They can actually lock together to form a tube. And it's a breathing tube, so that while the animal is buried during the daytime, it can still get oxygen from the water column through this breathing tube. And the males have these stupidly long claws that are really not much use to them, but I think there's something to do with mating or breeding or competition when they're looking for a mate. And we have seen these mask crabs, male mask crabs with the long claws. Females don't have those really long exaggerated claws. They have more sensible length claws. But you do see males wandering around the seabed holding a female at arm's length as they're walking around, and it's very bizarre to see. So again, something we really don't see in the summer, but you do see in the winter. Another one of my favourite animals, I talked about bobtails at the beginning, but another of my real favourites is the sea stickleback, or 15-spined stickleback. And we see lots of these in the shallow, especially among the seagrass or seaweed in the winter. Now, these animals, these fish, they when they breed, after they've bred, I should say, they die. So they don't have very long lives. They only live at the most 18 months, usually only a year. So during the summer, and they breed, in the spring, early spring, and then they die off. So you don't really see them during the summer until late summer, when you see lots of juveniles, lots of small ones around. But even then, they're very elusive. Their camouflage is superb. They peep at you from in between the seagrass blades or out from seaweed fronds. But if you take your eyes off them for a second, they just disappear and you can't find them again, because their camouflage is so superb. But in winter, you get large adults, and they're starting to get together for breeding. Sometimes you see really fat pregnant ones as well. So winter is a brilliant time to see these animals. As I say, they're called 15-spined sticklebacks, and you can just about, if you look carefully, make out some of the little spines in a row along their back in this photograph. They are related to freshwater sticklebacks, the 3-spined sticklebacks, although they're completely different in shape. But these are only found in the marine environment. And they'll often photobomb. So you'll be taking a photograph of maybe a bubble snail or something like that, and you'll suddenly realise that there's a sea stickleback peering straight down the camera lens at you. Again, they're attracted by the light, and they do follow you around as well. So you kind of take a picture and then you leave them alone, and then you'll look again and they're still there, sort of creeping around in between the seagrass blades. So they're very characterful. I absolutely love them. I think I've got another, yeah. And this one here has managed to catch well, it's got a little skeleton shrimp clinging on to its lower jaw. So I don't know if it's going to manage to eat that one or not. But as I said, they build a nest. Well, maybe I didn't say, but they males and females get together, they pair up, and then they build a nest, and the male produces really fine threads that look a bit like monofilament. And they wind these around seaweed fronds or seagrass fronds to make a little bunch, and that's their nest. So they lay the eggs in the nest, they guard the nest until the fish larvae hatch, and then, as I say, both parents die. So it's very sad. I love these little fish. And another animal that you're probably familiar with from the seashore, because they live intertidally underneath rocks, feeding on colonial sea squirts. This is Lamellaria perspicua. And as you can see from the mantle, they actually camouflage themselves as a little colony of sea squirts. And when you find them intertidally, you turn over a rock and they're there out of water, they just look like a little blob. You can't really make them out. But at this time of year, sort of January, February, we've noticed that they, if we're diving intertidally at high tides, they come out onto the top of the rocks, onto the top of the seaweed, and you can make them out a little bit better because they're active. So you can make out their little, there's a little siphon made from where the mantle coils round into a tube above the head. You can see their little sensory tentacles and their eyes, and they look much more like a mollusk rather than just a little colony of sea squirts or sponge or whatever. Also, yeah, I'll put this one in. Also, you see lots of the solar-powered sea slug, Elysia viridis, again that you can find intertidally, but we see masses and masses of these in the winter, including some quite big ones feeding on various types of algae. I'm not going to talk much about that one though. I'm going to move on a little bit. Something else, again, you can find all year round, but we see lots and lots of them in the winter. Quite often they're more visible because sea scorpions. So this is a long-spined sea scorpion, superb ambush predator using camouflage to hide it wherever it's sitting. It can change its skin color to match the colors of the surrounding algae where it's sitting. And it's very difficult to get a clear photograph of these when they are camouflaged because their camouflage is so superb. But in the winter, they tend to be more active, out and about, less seaweed cover for them to hide in, I guess. And so we can, you know, have a better look at them really. So they have this large head. The head takes up most of the body really, and a huge mouth. And what they do is they just sit and wait for something tasty to swim by, and then they'll just open up their mouth and engulf it. And they can eat animals almost as large as themselves, and then they just sit there digesting for a while. But we see lots and lots of these in winter. They do like colder water, but I think it's partly just because there's less algae cover, and also again because we're diving mostly in the dark, and they're more active at night. Not that they're very active anyway. But when you get close-up photos of certainly a fish, you realise, I mean, you don't see it when you're actually taking the photograph, but when you look later on at your photographs on a larger screen, you can see how much they are covered in tiny animals, little parasites, and down sort of in the middle at the bottom, you can see a little parasite there, a little crustacean clinging on. And you do see, we see lots of parasites on the sticklebacks as well, and all the fish. What I love about these sea scorpions are their eyelashes. They have these fleshy, sort of little fleshy spikes above their eye that look like eyelashes. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a Billy Winters, but this is a Billy Winters, and it's the name, it's the Dorset name really, given for a small prawn that's caught around Portland Harbour specifically in the cold winter months. And the fishermen called them Billy Winters or silly billies because they are, you know, there are lots of them in the winter, but they don't see them in the warm summer months. Its actual, probably more widely used common name is the Baltic prawn, and it is fished commercially around the Baltic. It does like colder water, so Palaemon adspersus is the scientific name for this prawn, but here in Dorset we call it Billy Winters, And again, it's something we only see in the winter. We don't see them in the summer. I don't know what happens to them, if it's something to do with their life cycle, but they certainly prefer the cold temperatures. And another one that we see more in the winter, but probably because it's nocturnal, is this one. We call it the night prawn, but its common name is actually Nika shrimp. I don't know if you've heard of that one, Processa edulis. It's mainly found around eelgrass beds, and it doesn't like light. So if you suddenly shine your torch on it, you'll see it trying to disappear, trying to get down into the undergrowth at the bottom of the seagrass meadow where it can hide from the light. So again, very difficult to get a photo, and I don't have any good. These are just quick snapshots. At night time, it's this lovely pinky, really bright, vivid, pinky, orangey colour. And in the daytime, it's much paler, more white coloured. This is one that's I managed to photograph that had its daylight colours. You can see the little white dots along its back there. That's not reflection from the light, that is its coloration. And night prawns are what are called protandric hermaphrodites. So they change sex. So you find small males, or you can find large females. What you never find are small females or large males, because they start off as males, and as they grow bigger, they change and become females. An interesting little aside. And we were talking about stalk jelly. Am I all right for time? Oh, let's wind up a little bit. We were talking about stalk jellyfish earlier. And strangely, here in Dorset, I don't know if it's to do with our very small tidal range because of where we are in the middle of the English Channel coast. But we don't very often see stalk jellyfish in rock pools like you do, but we do see them diving in shallow water, and specifically in the winter months. There are some species, well, there is a species that you find in the summer, but in the winter, there are several species that we find. So during the cold and the wave-tossed winter months, the seaweed fronds in the shallows become decorated with these tiny jewels, and they really are pretty. And as the winter turns to spring, the jellies bloom. So they really like the colder temperatures here. In the late winter and early spring, they tend to be very small but very numerous. And then as the water temperature starts to increase, they become less numerous, but the ones that are left become much bigger. And we get 3 different species commonly here. We get this one, the kaleidoscope stalk jellyfish, Haliclistus. And here's another photo of it with a small pheasant shell. We also get what I call the vase stalk jellyfish, which is Craterolophus convolvulus. And we also get the Maltese cross-stalk jellyfish, which is Calvadosia crux melitensis. And they grow to a maximum of about 3 centimetres across the bell. And they're obviously related to real jellyfish and other stinging animals in the group Cnidaria. And like their relatives, they have stinging cells or nematocysts, which they use to paralyze their prey, so that makes them easier to handle and ingest. And here you can see there's a little, I think it's a Rissoa snail, possibly, that's got stuck to one of the sticky pom-poms on the tentacle of this stalk jellyfish. And then here we go, it was completely engulfed. Now, I don't know if stalk jellyfish feed much on tiny snails, or what happens to the shell. Presumably that's spat out once the animal's been ingested, if that's what it's happening. But the seaweed at Kimmeridge is absolutely covered in tiny, tiny snails of a variety of species. And the stalk jellyfish feed, we were talking about it earlier. I think when the sea's quite rough, they seem to like to be on the very tips of the seaweed fronds, where they're swished about. It's like being on a white knuckle ride. They're swished about through the water. They're covering a large area, and presumably managing to catch with their sticky tentacles lots of plankton or species from the water column. But they're also being swished along the seaweed fronds, and presumably catching animals that live there. So tiny crustaceans, tiny mollusks. The seaweed is absolutely covered in animals. When the weather's a bit calmer, we find that they tend to get down further into the algae. So they're not at the tips of the fronds, but they're further down, a bit more hidden, and maybe they're whether they stop feeding when it's calm or whether they're just feeding on things that are crawling around the seaweed, I don't know. But certainly they seem to be more visible when they're being tossed around in rough weather. Not that we're diving much in rough weather, but sometimes there's quite a bit of swell, and they really do swish around, and they seem to love that. So I'm guessing that's why we see much more of them in the winter months. Just a couple more things. That diving in the winter is very different because of the lack of algae. So as I said, we're diving in very shallow water. So in the summer months, it can be completely carpeted in algae, and quite often to see some of the sessile animals that are stuck to the rocks. So things like these trumpet anemones, sponges, and other animals are completely blanketed in algae. But in the winter, that's all died back, and it makes these animals much more visible and much easier to appreciate. Love these little trumpet anemones. And something else that we found is that previously we thought, or we were told, that seahorses tend to migrate away from shallow coastal waters in the winter because obviously they're vulnerable to being washed up by waves, and that they migrate into deeper water, maybe 30 meters deep. Now, it always seemed quite extraordinary to us that seahorses, which are very poor swimmers and very slow swimmers, should go on such a long migration. And what we found is that actually they seem to stay put. Certainly if they're in a sheltered place, which is where they tend to be anyway, but sheltered harbours, they do sometimes get washed up in the winter. So we knew that they were, some of them at least were around in the winter and did sort of get washed up in winter storms. But what we found as well is that they're living all through the winter in the same place. They're not really migrating at all, and we don't see so many of them. But so maybe some migrate and some don't. But some of them certainly stay all year round in fairly shallow water. And that's something we wouldn't have known if we weren't diving through the winter. Now, this photograph, I have to just point out, was taken quite a few years ago. So you do have to have a license, certainly if you're looking for seahorses, not if you just stumble across one and you want to take a photograph for the record, which is what we do. But those photographs tend to be, well, they're without flash, so they tend to be not great photos. You can just about make out a seahorse if you look hard and for the sighting. But that's why I've used this photograph from a long time ago, before you needed to have a license to photograph them. And that's about it really. Although winter diving, and especially night diving, may not appeal to many people, it is cold. You do get very cold, and it is in the dark, which isn't everyone's cup of tea. It's certainly been an eye-opener, and we feel that we're seeing and learning new things about some of the sea's most fascinating creatures. And we're seeing some of the things that we commonly see intertidally in a new light, from a new perspective, really. And there's always something new to see, and the colour of and the variety of wildlife picked out in torchlight is often a surprise, and certainly something that we really enjoy. I have written a few blogs if anybody's interested, and one of them is about diving in a winter wonderland. So that's the link if you're interested in reading a bit more about our diving. And that's it.